of liberation. This morning, we're going to enter into a story of a woman who does not believe that she is not going to get justice. She refuses to believe that the judge has the final say. She refuses to believe that the oppression of the system in which she believes, in which she lives, is the final word. And in her refusal to believe, she comes to believe in the justice of God and the liberation that God has intended for her. The story is about a widow who has been wronged. And she is bringing her case before the judge, even though she knows that as a widow she has no social standing, that she has very little chance of winning, and yet she brings her case before the judge, and she is not having any kind of dismissal. She is not allowing the injustice to occur. The judge has every intention of foiling her quest for justice, and yet she refuses to believe. So there's a few elements I want to explore this morning. First of all is the clarity and the power of purpose. Her clarity about getting justice from her opponent. Her clarity about her purpose becomes a powerful move toward the justice she seeks. And second of all, there is just sheer persistence. Over and over, the story repeats. The judge had no intention of giving her justice, but this woman wore him down. She persisted until he gave in. And then third of all, I want to look at the power of prayer in all this. Jesus tells us at the outset that this is a story that helps us understand what prayer is all about, even though there's no actual mention of prayer in the story itself. The story itself is an illustration of what prayer is all about. So we're going to look at purpose and persistence and prayerful process. So purpose is the foundation of power, even when the farthest we can get around purpose is survival. Even when the only clarity we have about purpose is that we are called to overcome the situation we're in and survive. I want to share a story from a woman named Meg Brown, who wrote in this week's edition of the Christian Century about her story, about her mother dying of cancer when she was 12 years old. Her mother had been battling cancer for 5 years, and she was determined not to die because she was determined to raise her children and protect them from the alcoholism of her husband. There would be nights when she would take the children out of the bed and just drive them around in the car until the father went to sleep. There would be nights when the police would come over and she would be bruised and broken, and the police would help get the father to bed and then would tell her that a man's home is his castle. Eventually her mother died, and one night her dad came for her, and she ran to her room and she slammed the door and she locked it, and she waited for hours until he finally went to sleep. And then she got very clear in her conviction that she was not intended to live this way. And she didn't have a lot of clarity about what that meant, and she didn't have a lot of understanding about what her options were, but she was very clear in her purpose to get free of this situation. And so she packed her bags and she left the house. And the only thing she knew was that she had an invitation to stay over at Sally's that night, and the conviction that her body is the temple of God. She was hearing a word that a man's home is his castle. She was living a word that she was sacred. Clarity of purpose is power. Each of us have a unique purpose. We have particular gifts. We have unique passions that are at the heart of the meaningful life that we are created to live. This purpose, even when it's only survival, is a powerful, powerful motivator. And in this particular case of the widow, the case she has brought against her opponent, we don't even have details about what it is a powerful motivator in terms of her getting justice. And so she persists. So the title for the sermon this morning, Nevertheless, She Persisted, of course, comes from a situation earlier in the year when Senator Elizabeth Warren refused to yield to the confirmation of Senator Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. And she continued to read from the words of Coretta Scott King, even after the senators had told her she had to stop, even after the senators told her she was out of order, even after the senators demanded that she stop. Senator McConnell put it, nevertheless, she persisted. And that became a battle cry for women who are facing any number of glass ceilings, any number of windows that are not open, doors that will not open, and certainly describes this widow who's clear about her purpose and is not giving up. Widows in her society at that time had access to property only through males, had access to social status only through males. That's why a widow is in a particularly vulnerable state, because at whatever age she's at, she loses the access to property and social status that she had. Throughout the scriptures, there's a particular command to protect widows and orphans because of the vulnerability they have in this society. But this woman is persisting in her cause for justice. And not only does that social status go against her, but the scripture tells us over and over this story, twice in these 5 verses, that this judge has no fear of God, has no respect for people. Twice this is repeated to make it very clear to us that she has 0% chance of winning her case. Nevertheless, she moves forward and she wins. In the series, we're reading the teaching of Jesus next to the new book, Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Maree Brown. And particularly this week, we're looking at her chapter on nonlinear and iterative strategies for change. Oftentimes, we're told that the world operates in a straight line. That may be true for those for whom the rules of the world work. But for any for whom the world rules do not work, life does not happen in a straight line. Oftentimes, there are roadblocks that come up in our way. So iterative means keeping at it. It means not being deterred. It means bold strategies. It means finding a way around a roadblock. That the widow is out in territory without a roadmap. I mean, the rules of justice are designed not to give her justice. She is on her own here. There's no telling what she does or how she moves through this process. And there may well be times that she failed. And in nonlinear and iterative strategy, even failure becomes a part of the road to victory. I led New Day Church through a colossal failure in the year 2015. We had a bold plan to start a second location. It made a lot of sense in a way in terms of getting up to scale and being able to become abundantly sustainable and all that. It was filled with questions and roadblocks. Our bishop at that time was all for it. Bishop McLee, you'll remember, had been out here a couple times. He was all excited about it. He had a Harlem initiative. He was very interested in us establishing a second site in Harlem. He was even going to give us a building. He was going to give us support to get another staff person to do it. So we started out on this road. We had a New Year's Eve service going into 2015. We had about 140 people out. It was exciting. It was energizing. We were having some open mics that were getting some people out. And then things began to collapse. Certainly Bishop McLee's death was a big part of that. He passed away. The new leadership was not about the same kinds of things he was about. The support that was promised to us never came through. I began to burn out, running back and forth. Work in the Bronx began to go down. By June, we decided we had to pull the plug. Now, anyone who's been through colossal failure knows that it is not a pleasant process. There are incredible amounts of shame and embarrassment, and you go kind of pushing something and then it collapses. There are all kinds of senses about, credibility and all. I mean, it took me about 1.5 years to kind of get over it personally, and I think I'm probably still moving through the process. But we need to understand that this whole thing around failure really comes out of this linear model, really comes out of this expectations that everything you do ought to succeed. There are things that happen in life that get in the way. There are situations we miscalculate, we make mistakes, and things don't work out. Even failure in a nonlinear model becomes a road to success. Though what we learn about what didn't work becomes part of the formula for developing what does work. And as we move now toward New Day Cafe or other things, these lessons that we've learned are very critical in terms of moving to the next stage. The widow, in her persistence, prevails. And Jesus describes this process as the way prayer works. And I think this is an understanding of prayer that may be different than what we usually have. I think a lot of us have an idea of prayer as a kind of magic. That prayer is something you pray for and then it happens. If you have enough faith, it happens. If you don't have enough faith, it doesn't happen. My experience, particularly this chapter was very helpful for me in so many different ways, but understanding prayer as non-linear and iterative transforms my understanding of what prayer is. Oftentimes, in prayer, I have gotten some kind of clarity about something and kind of moved it out into the world and then discovered that it actually wasn't going to take me to where I felt called to go. That prayer is not necessarily about giving you the answer. Prayer is about continuing to move us forward. I remember when I first felt called to start a new church, it took me 9 months to get to the place where I had the sense and the clarity to actually act, to actually move forward. And one of the things I noticed is that in my rational mind, in my everyday life, I came up with 100 reasons why it wouldn't work, 100 reasons why it wasn't smart, 100 reasons why it wasn't rational. And yet, in my prayer life, there continued to rise this calling, that this is at the core of your being, that this is what you're about, that this is what you're called to do. As we enter into a regular practice of prayer, you may discover this kind of disconnect between what the world is telling me and what the depth of my soul is telling me. Sometimes we may want to step back because we fear that this is not going to get us to where we want, and yet there's something that persists inside us, that this is our calling. Wouldn't you love to know the way this widow's story really played out? Why did Jesus tell this story so briefly in 5 lines? And 3 of those lines about how it can't possibly work. Somehow in her process of trying, and I mean, she's got all the cards stacked against her. I mean, she is someone who is trying to make DACA work in the era of Trump. She is black and transgender and dealing with the violence in this society. She is LGBTQ pastor in the United Methodist Church trying to live fully into her calling. This is the widow that's got things stacked against her. What did she do? Wouldn't you love to know the strategies? I mean, maybe she hung out after hours and waited for the judge on the corner. You know, maybe she camped out outside the judge's house and held up signs. Maybe she organized some of her fellow widows and they followed him around. Maybe they had a letter writing campaign. You know, maybe she found out who the judge was connected to and talked to them. Who knows all the different strategies? Maybe Jesus doesn't tell us the details on purpose, because the details are going to vary depending on our particular situation. But the details are not what is so important as the persistence and the purpose. She knows what she's called to. She's persisting in it. And the prayerful process where we continue, Jesus, I think, is inviting us, where we continue to tell God what we need, to persist in it, that prayer needs to be a persistent process. That prayer is not about asking for something and, oh, I got it, oh, I didn't get it. No, it's meant to drive us deep. It's a purpose that drives us deep into clarity and a persistence around the pursuit of our purpose. What is it that you feel called to? When you really get down into the depths of your soul, blocking out the voices of those who would make you question yourself, blocking out the voices of those who have another agenda for you, not deterred by the obstacles and roadblocks. What is it that you feel like your gifts, your passions are directing you toward? Do we dare step out on that road? Do we dare open ourselves to a prayerful process that keeps that call in our guts front and center? Do we dare to continue to persist? Do we dare to trust what we know to be true in our deepest self? Gracious God, we open ourselves to you in our lives, knowing that there's so much that would keep our attention moving in another direction. We open ourselves, God, to the calling that you have on our lives, and to the true meaning of faith, that is not an easy road, but yet is a remarkably fruitful road. Gracious God, we come to you sharing our doubts, sharing our fears, and yet willing to be open, willing to trust, willing to allow you to guide us on the road that leads us to the relationships, that leads us to the calling that we know at the deepest part of our being is who we are. Amen.